Shortly after you start getting a lot of your projects and your contexts and dumping in your organization, shortly after you start getting some of that in place, or maybe in your case, you want to do it at the onset, you're going to want to get the preferences for OmniFocus nailed down. So to get to your preferences, like most Apple applications, you can simply hit Command, comma, in order to pull that up. So if I hit Command, comma, we get our preferences. And the first thing you're presented with is the general preferences. And for me, coming from OmniFocus 1, whenever I upgraded to OmniFocus 2, one of the first things I had to get used to was the outlining. How do you hit the tab bar? How do you hit the inner escape button? How does all that stuff work? And I know that typically with software like this, if the application gets upgraded and they change some of that, it's probably better to go ahead and learn the new and how they operate it. So for me, I try to leave it on the modern mode in this case, and it didn't take very long, a week or two, and I had it completely committed to memory, and it was no longer an issue. So I always recommend that you go with the modern mode. The two down at the bottom, quick entry shortcut and the clipping shortcut. These two are effectively the same thing, but with one slight difference. The first of which is the quick entry shortcut. So this is something I use fairly frequently if I'm working on a project and I have something new that comes to mind that I need to do. I can hit that Control Option space, and I am presented with that quick entry shortcut dialog. Now we'll go into that in more detail in another video. And the clippings shortcut is very similar. It pulls up that quick entry shortcut dialog, but it does so with the selected information pre-populated into that dialog. And again, I'll go into the details of that in another video, but for this point, let's go ahead and set the shortcut for that because I have a custom shortcut I like to use for it. And you'll notice that whenever I click on that, it does bring up this whole process that explains how to do it and some of the things to keep in mind whenever you jump into this. For me, I know what I'm doing, so I'm going to get rid of this. And I know that behind the scenes, it opened up my preferences here. And the thing that I'm looking for is this services on the side. And whenever I get into that and I scroll down, I will find somewhere in here, yes, send to inbox. So I'll notice that OmniFocus 2 has send to inbox added to this list, and it doesn't have a shortcut currently, but I want to add one. So if I click on the dialog here, I can add a shortcut, and I add the one that I use constantly, which is Control-Command-O. I have my own little method of how I come up with those particular combinations. They're unique to everybody. The main point here is that it is unique to me, so you probably don't want to use that one. If you want to, go for it, but you're going to want to pick one that's unique to you. Back to our preferences. The next one on this list is organization. And the first thing you're presented with is this clean up inbox items. And I highly recommend that you set this to a project and a context, because what that means is the items won't be removed from your inbox until you've given that item both a project and a context, as it spells out. Otherwise, it will stay in your inbox, and it means that you still have something to do with it. I have seen very few systems where it's helpful to just have it as one or the other. I don't really understand how those work. To me, they're more complicated than they need to be, so I always immediately change this to both project and a context. You can also change when it decides to make the cleanup process work, as to when it pulls from that, or it will read when to move things. You can either have it do it immediately as soon as you add them and you hit enter, or you can have it only happen when you change perspectives. For me, I like to do this immediately, so I'm going to change this to immediately. And that means that anytime I make a change, it happens automatically. That's effectively what that means. The next one, new projects and action groups are sequential or parallel. The vast majority of the new projects that I create are going to be parallel projects, so I'm going to leave that as the default. I know that in some cases, people will create projects and they're always sequential. They're pretty much templated systems, and that works fine. If that's for you, go for it. For me, I know that I create a lot of projects that I can't spell out from beginning to end, so I need to go ahead and add to them as I can, try to find stalled projects and add new actions to them as they come up. So I know for me, I need that to be parallel. The last one on this list is whether or not to include the project titles or the group titles within a project hierarchy. whenever you have a perspective that doesn't work off the project hierarchy. And primarily this is in your context view from the standard position. If you're creating custom perspectives, you can alter those. So it is possible to create perspectives that work off of the context list. And a lot of them are. Most of the ones that I work off every day do work off of the context list. And that means that it's possible for the project titles and group titles to show up there. It always clutters things up for me. It just seems to be too much. So I always uncheck that just so that I know that my lists are nothing but tasks and they don't show project titles as well. So I'm going to check this off. The next section in here is the layout. Now, you can very specifically alter what you see in the list. And for me, I always want to customize things, so I immediately jump over to the custom columns. So if I move over to the custom column side, you can see that I now get to mess with this, and also in the background, it did change that up a little bit because it puts everything in a line instead of having it be multiple lines there. So if I move this off to the side here and make this to where you can kind of see down below here and go back to fluid, you can see that it does change the layout that you're seeing there. You go back to custom, and now you can see those items in that list. So bring this back to the middle. The only thing that I want to pull off of this particular list over the defaults is the flag button. To me, I don't ever click that button. It's not one that I use because I always hit the keyboard shortcut for it, which is Command-Shift-L. And that will flag the items that I have selected. So that's my default way of doing it, so it doesn't make sense to me to have that button there. At one point, I was playing around with having the estimated duration on here. I was playing around with potentially having summaries of how much time I thought a task list would take me. I found that I'm really bad at estimating time, and it just got to be cluttered, so I feel better leaving that off. So that can adjust the layout that you're seeing. But at the bottom of that list, you'll also get to see that you can omit the projects and context columns whenever those are the specific perspectives that you're looking at. So if I go to the perspectives list, it doesn't add a column for the project because you can see the project that you're in already. Same thing from the context view. So if you want to omit those, you can. If you want to add them, you just uncheck those and you're good to go. The next section here is the style. Now this is a rather new thing. As I'm recording this, is a rather new thing that OmniFocus has integrated into their application. And I like to tweak this heavily as much as I can, and it means that I end up altering the view of this pretty significantly. For me, I like to run the fonts a little bit smaller. I have pretty good eyes and I work on computers all day, so to me it makes sense to make that smaller. I also really prefer dark views. So I like to run this whole thing from a dark view. And I'll get into the styles in a different video, but this is how I like to operate. For the sake of this video, I am going to leave these at their defaults just because it's a little more standard. It's a little easier to see whenever you're looking at videos. So I'm going to leave those at their defaults. And I'm going to do the same thing for the layout. I'm going to switch back over here and leave it at the fluid just because that's the default view and that's what most people are used to looking at. So if we go to dates and times, this is where things can get a little tricky for some, but for me, it's pretty simple. Due soon, so that indicates when OmniFocus will start to throw badges and alerts and that type of thing. For me, I want to know when something has a due date. I want to know that it has a due date about 5 days in advance. So I'm going to adjust this to the 5 days. And that just means that whenever something it has a due date and that due date is within 5 days from right now, it will put that yellow flag on it. And then if it passes, of course, I get the red flag. But that's ultimately what that means, is at what point do you want things to start throwing that yellow flag? You've also got default times for defer dates and due dates. If I add a defer date, you can tell at what time in that day to start. I prefer to just leave it at midnight. That just means that it will get off my plate today and it will show up that next morning whenever I do that. So I like to just leave it at midnight. That seems to be a pretty common and a very easy way to do that. Default time for due dates, though, for me, my day ends when I go to bed. And that's just the nature of being an entrepreneur and being your own business. So I prefer to move that up until 9 p.m. So I'm going to adjust that to the 9 p.m. and I will leave it there. So some people like to say that the default time for a due date. So if I just put in a day, it'll automatically assign the time for the day. And some people want that to be the end of their workday. For me, I want that to be the end of my actual full-on day. So that's just depending on how you want those to work. And at the end of this, what's your default review cycle? For me, the vast majority of my projects need to be reviewed weekly, and I just leave it at the default there of every 1 week. If you operate on a longer time frame, you may want that to be every month. Just depends on how you want to operate and how often you want to look over your projects. The next section here is notifications. There's quite a bit here that you can tweak and work with. So you can look at the reminders piece. Where do you want to see those? As far as do you want to see a badge? Do you want to see it in the sidebar? Do you want to see them as notifications? You can pick and choose where you want all of those to land. So if you have the dock icon set up, if I go down to the bottom here, it would show a badge right there on the OmniFocus icon. So just as a demonstration here, I'm going to switch over to this particular task. I'm going to give it a due date of tomorrow, and because I've set my default for 9 p.m., you'll see that it shows 9 p.m. in that due date. And because it's tomorrow, obviously it's going to show me that yellow flag. Now, if I switch back over to my preferences here, I've got it set to show me reminders in the dock. So if I go down here, I see that I now have a 1 on the badge. And if I check off in the sidebar, you'll notice over here on the side that I now have a 1 next to that folder that shows me that there's a due item in that folder. So it's just a way to see where is that item in the list. I typically leave this one off just because I don't usually work off of things that way. I've got my dashboard set up that I can work off, so that works pretty well for me there. And then you can have as notifications turned on, which just means that on your Mac, when that due date shows up, it will give you a notification. Well, in my case, my Mac is permanently in Do Not Disturb mode because all of my notifications that are necessary go through my phone. My phone's always with me, so that's where I keep all of those. So in my case, I keep this off. Highlight perspectives. This is an interesting one that I think is extremely helpful. So you'll notice over here on the sidebar that Forecast and Flagged have a highlight next to them. And that's what this pertains to. If I were to uncheck the Flagged, you'll notice that the flagged highlight is no longer there. But if I put it back on, it returns. So it's a pretty slick way to remind yourself that you have something in that particular perspective that needs your attention. It works for the review thing. It works for the inbox. I leave all of these on just because it's a way for me to see which ones are where that need acted on. So it's kind of nice for me to leave those on. Being reminded about overdue and due items like soon, that's really helpful. So I do keep those on. That also carries over to the iOS side so that I get notified about them. So I like to leave those on. Show in today, that pertains to the notification center on the Mac. You can choose to display a list of items from any of these perspectives that are listed there, or you can choose to show a custom perspective. In my case, I like to show a custom perspective. The one I like to use is called Dashboard, but I currently don't have it created yet because we haven't gone through the perspectives yet. So for right now, I'm going to just leave that at the default of what's due today, and I will adjust that later on whenever we get to that particular part of the series. The last item on this list is publish due items as calendar alarms. Some people like to have these items show up as events on their calendar. In my case, I don't want that to happen at all. The next section here is synchronization. We touched on this in a separate video of the OmniSync server. You can choose how you want to sync your information across devices. We've already been through this particular set in a separate video, so I'll link to that in the resources down below the video. And then the last section here is for update. And my case, I want to make sure that I get all the new updates for OmniFocus when they come in, so I have it set to check for updates automatically daily. And in my particular case, I know that the Omni Group is extremely particular with your data and your hardware information. So in my case, I prefer to go ahead and send them information. I rarely do this, but this is one case where I prefer to go ahead and send that information whenever I have an issue, which actually in my case is very rare. I rarely have that show up, and if it is, it's because I shut down my computer at the wrong time. So it's just a way to help them to continue to perfect the system. So that takes care of the preferences on the Mac. So let's switch over to the iPhone and take a look at the settings that we have over there. So if I'm looking at my home screen like we are right now, and I pull down and see the top here, I can see settings in the center at the top. If I go into those settings, there's a lot of information here that we can start to work with. We've been through the sync method already. You can adjust how the push notifications work. In this particular case, everything's working fine. I want to use push because it will allow me to continually get the information into my device. If I want to see the details around that, you can see all of that here. So it's easy to get all of your data to continually sync using that, and that's one of the reasons I always leave that on. It does make it helpful to see how all of the data is coming in. You can see the full log of what's going on there. It's a lot of interesting information. I never come in here because it's just not something that I like to see very frequently. So I don't typically look at a lot of this information. Sometimes it is nice to see a list of these registered devices. I specifically found this helpful whenever I left my corporate job because I had a few company devices that I was running OmniFocus on, so it was helpful for me to come in here and see, okay, do I still have those registered? Are those still syncing? It was very helpful to see where those were at. So this can help you in determining which devices are currently syncing with your account and with your database. Again, if I come down to colors, me being a dark screen person, I like to turn this on and just work off of the dark view. Again, for the sake of these videos, I'm going to leave it off, but that's my preference, is to use that. You can have it set to switch automatically, and you can have it adjust depending on your screen brightness, and then using some of the auto screen methods in the newer iOS versions and devices, it can automatically switch for you. I prefer to just determine it, and in this case, I'm going to leave it on the lighter color. Like we did on the Mac, you can adjust some of these dates, and specifically the due soon, and because I adjusted it on the Mac, that particular setting has synced over, so I have that set up already. And here I can also set up the sounds, alerts, and badges and all of that, and in this case I want to allow notifications, and you can determine which particular items will apply to the badge that goes with this. I actually have this set up to show me all of the top three, so the overdue, due soon, and flagged, because that tells me from my dashboard, it tells me how many items are on my dashboard and how many things I want to try to get done that day. So it does help me to have all of those checked off. The reminders, again, I like to show the alerts, I like to play the sounds. My phone is very rarely going to ding at me just because I have very few notifications turned on. OmniFocus is one exception. I have a lot of things in here that are important, and if it's gonna be overdue or it's due soon, I need to know about it, and I need to know about it now. So this is one case where I will allow a notification significantly. With location reminders, there are a lot of ways that you can use location-based context, and that's what this is going to use. So I do set it up to allow the location piece, and that specifically allows the contexts to do the location-aware alerts. So that's what that does. And again, you can choose whether or not they show alerts or play sounds. You can really fine tune this quite a bit. So that's overall the sounds and alerts. If we go back, you can dictate of all of those notifications, which are the main lists that you're going to show in the today view, which you can pull down from the top. Again, we'll get to that in another video. And that's also the list that would show up on the Apple Watch, which I do not own. So unfortunately, I'm not able to show you how all of that works. But for the most part, my understanding of it is that simply shows that same list on the watch as what you could see on the today view. In my case, I like to use the custom perspective of the dashboard, which we're going to set up in another video. And when we do that, we'll go through and we'll tweak all of these settings. Going back, again, you can do the calendar integration from here like I talked about on the Mac. Again, we'll do that in a separate video. And one thing that's here, it says capture for reminders, and we're going to do some more detail on this later, but I do heavily leverage reminders capture. Essentially, what it means is it allows you to add items to your OmniFocus database using Siri, which is incredibly helpful. So if I turn on reminders capture, I can pick and choose which of the lists that I want to use for this. In this case, I'm going to add it to task because whenever I add something to OmniFocus through Siri, I will often say, like it says here, Siri add such and such to my task list. So that's a really helpful way in order to get things into your database. Going back, I mentioned earlier that I am a big Text Expander fan. If you have Text Expander on your iOS device, you can use those snippets with the default keyboard if you were to update these here. It's pretty simple. You just tap on that button. It'll take you over to Text Expander, and then it brings you back. It uses the URL schemes in the background, so it's pretty handy. Again, send anonymous data. I do this quite a bit just because I want them to be able to create the best product possible. So that's why I turn that on. And then at the very bottom here, you have three things. You can export all of your data to a CSV. You can check out your backups. So if you go into backups, you can see the automatic piece. You can see how often it's doing it. And then you can manually trigger a backup as well, which is helpful if you're going to start messing with it and doing a lot of updating or migrations. It's really helpful to be able to just do a backup right now. And then you have that if you have an issue. And then at the very bottom is you can reset. I'm not going to do that because it will completely reset the whole database. So it can reset the entire app on your phone and you can start from scratch. So overall, that is the list of settings in iOS. It's pretty handy. There's quite a bit that you can tweak on this. You can really make it a pretty detailed and a very custom feel overall.